the sea had always sung to Maggie. In the early years, when her children were still small and her husband Michael was alive, the waves crashing outside their cottage windows felt like a lullaby, a promise that no matter how hard the day, something vast and dependable would always be there. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Now, at 70, the ocean was the only thing that hadn't left. Maggie lived alone in the weathered house perched on the cliffs, a house once brimming with the clamor of laughter, burnt toast on Sunday mornings, muddy footprints across the kitchen floor, and bedtime stories interrupted by pillow fights. She had given her whole self to it, raising Jessica and Daniel, managing the home while Michael built a thriving architectural firm. Every room held a memory she had dusted and preserved with quiet devotion. But lately, even the memories felt like strangers. After Michael passed away 5 years ago, Maggie's world narrowed into silence. Jessica and Daniel had grown into busy lives of their own families, careers, travels. They called on holidays, sent photos of ski trips and birthday cakes with captions like, "Wish you were here," and occasionally mailed flowers with pre-printed cards. They spoke of their father often, reminiscing about his stories, his ambition, the vacations he had planned. But not once did they mention the woman who had packed their lunches at dawn, who had taken night shifts when Michael's business nearly folded, who sat alone in hospital waiting rooms when Jessica broke her arm and Daniel had appendicitis. Maggie never corrected them. She simply smiled through the phone, said, "That sounds lovely, dear," and then stared at the blinking cursor of silence once the call ended. The photos on the mantel were all family shots, but her presence in them seemed peripheral, a hand on a shoulder, a shadow behind someone's laugh. In family group chats, her comments often went unacknowledged. Jessica once posted a tribute to "the man who made me who I am today," and Maggie had read it 4 times, searching for a mention of herself. There was none. What hurt most wasn't the absence of praise. It was the quiet rewriting of the family's story, one where Maggie had become invisible. She no longer felt like the heart of the home. She was the afterthought, the quiet echo in the background, a soft voice that didn't interrupt, a presence that didn't demand space. In that big house by the sea, filled with faded photographs and old promises, Maggie sat by the window, a cup of tea cooling in her hand, and wondered, at what point had she stopped being seen? It started with an innocent suggestion. Jessica, Maggie's only daughter, had decided to hold her wedding at the house Maggie had lived in for over 4 decades. At first, it felt like a full-circle moment, celebrating a new beginning in the very place where Jessica had taken her first steps, painted the walls with her little handprints, and whispered teenage secrets across the kitchen table. But Maggie soon realized the request had nothing to do with sentimentality. "This place is so outdated," Jessica said one afternoon, stepping into the living room and scanning the floral wallpaper that had once taken Maggie weeks to hang. "We'll need to cover this up. It's not exactly Instagram-worthy." That word, Instagram-worthy, landed like a stone in Maggie's chest. Her home wasn't a photo set. It was where she had nursed Jessica through fevers, where her late husband had proposed during a snowstorm on the porch, where holidays and heartbreaks had passed beneath its roof. But none of that mattered now. Not the memories, not the effort, not the quiet love stitched into every detail. Jessica brought in a wedding planner who spoke in polished tones and moved through the house as if assessing an old property she couldn't wait to tear down. "This window doesn't get enough light. We'll block it off. And the drapes?" She looked at Maggie. "They'll have to go. We're going for soft minimalism, not vintage clutter." Maggie nodded gently, folding her hands in front of her. She didn't argue, but inside, something shifted. The house had always been her haven, warm, imperfect, lived in. Now, it was being stripped of meaning, transformed into a backdrop for curated happiness. A shell. "You understand, right, Mom?" Jessica said one evening, brushing crumbs off the counter. "This is the biggest day of my life. We just want everything to look perfect." Perfect. A word that suddenly felt more like a wall than a goal. Maggie smiled faintly and said nothing. But the ache was real. Her home wasn't being honored. It was being used, rewritten to fit someone else's narrative. It was no longer the space that had held her family together. It had become a stage, and she, at best, a prop to be tucked away once the camera stopped clicking. And that was the moment Maggie began to wonder. If everything she built could be so easily dismissed, what else in her life had simply been taken for granted? Maggie didn't expect grand gestures. At 75, she had long stopped imagining confetti, candles, or champagne. All she wanted that year was a simple dinner, just a few hours surrounded by her children's voices, the clink of cutlery, and the warmth of being remembered. She spent the day in the kitchen, her movements slower than they once were, but still filled with care. She made Jessica's favorite herb-roasted chicken and mashed potatoes just the way Daniel used to like them, extra creamy with a hint of garlic. She even baked the old family chocolate cake recipe, the one they'd devoured every year since they were little, decorated with chocolate curls she shaved by hand. By 6 o'clock, the table was set, candles lit, and Maggie had changed into her soft lavender cardiganthe, one Jessica said brought out the color in her eyes. She poured 2 glasses of wine, placing them carefully at the spots where her children were meant to sit. But the door didn't open. At 6:15, a text came from Jessica. "Mom, something came up. I'll try to stop by tomorrow. Love you." At 6:22, Daniel called briefly. "Sorry, Mom. I totally spaced. It's been a crazy week at work. Rain check?" She held the phone to her ear a moment longer after he hung up, as if waiting for something more: a laugh, an apology, a pause where she could say how much she'd hoped for this one evening. The food remained untouched. The candles burned low. Maggie sat at the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The house was quiet, save for the distant ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft hum of the refrigerator. She didn't cry. She didn't scold or call back. She simply sat there, looking at the 2 empty chairs across from her. The ones that, year after year, had been filled with laughter, stories, and love. Now they held only silence and a truth she had avoided for far too long. She blew out the candles before they burned down to nothing. A small flicker of hope had brought her to this evening. But now, as she cleared the dishes alone, she began to understand. Love, when not nurtured, fades. And being forgotten by those you hold closest doesn't happen all at once. It happens one missed dinner at a time. For years, the house on Sycamore Street had stood as Maggie's badge of devotion, a structure held together not just by beams and bricks, but by decades of sacrifice, silences, and unconditional love. Every corner bore traces of her. The curtains she'd sewn by hand, the scuffed doorway where her children once measured their growth, the kitchen walls that had absorbed laughter, arguments, and years of cooking meals no one ever thanked her for. But one morning, after yet another restless night, Maggie stood by the window and realized the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a vault filled with memories that never gave back, with echoes of voices that had grown cold, and with a presence that demanded she stay small to keep others comfortable. The decision came not in anger, but in clarity. She reached for her notebook, the same one where she'd once written grocery lists and reminders, and wrote a single sentence: "It's time to let it go." The first call was to a realtor, a soft-spoken woman named Holly who didn't ask too many questions. Maggie appreciated that. When Holly asked about her goals for the sale, Maggie answered plainly, "Freedom, not profit. I want to start over." Together, they walked through the house for a final inspection. Maggie noticed how faded everything had become: the wallpaper, the light fixtures, even the energy. There was no sadness, just a quiet affirmation. This chapter had already ended. She was just signing the last page. The house sold faster than expected. Within 3 weeks, the papers were signed, and a young couple with a baby on the way moved in. Maggie left a small note taped to the inside of the kitchen cabinet. "May this home give you what it once gave. Me hope, warmth, and room to grow. Don't forget to say thank you to each other." She didn't cry when she handed over the keys. Instead, she stood on the sidewalk with her bag packed, watching the door close behind her for the last time. She didn't look back. The house was no longer her burden. It was no longer her story. Maggie didn't just sell a house. She reclaimed her breath, her space, and her name. She didn't owe her past anything more. Now, everything she built next would be for herself and those who truly saw her worth. The call came just after sunrise. Jessica's voice was sharp, clipped, more disbelief than concern. "Mom, you sold the house? Our house? You didn't even tell us?" Margaret sat at her small kitchen table in the Well house, a mug of chamomile tea warming her palms. She had expected the reaction, though not the swiftness. News traveled fast when people felt entitled to what was never theirs. Jessica wasn't finished. "That's where I was going to have the wedding, Mom. In the garden. You knew that." There it was, the unspoken truth tumbling out. It wasn't really about the house. It was about expectations, assumptions, convenience. It always had been. "I didn't know that, sweetheart," Margaret replied calmly. "You never asked. You only assumed I'd still be there, waiting." Moments later, Daniel called. His tone was less shrill but no less accusatory. "Seriously, Mom? You sold everything without even telling us? That's selfish, and honestly, kind of impulsive." Margaret felt the old ache stir in her chest, not because his words hurt, but because they were so familiar. She'd heard that tone before, wrapped in different excuses. Selfish, impulsive, dramatic. All labels used when a woman stopped bending. She let him speak, let him wind himself into knots of disappointment and frustration. When he finally paused, she asked gently, "Daniel, can I ask you something?" He grunted an exhausted yes. "When was the last time you asked me if I was okay?" There was silence. A long, guilty silence. "You didn't even notice I was gone until the money stopped. Until the babysitter was no longer there. Until the living, breathing cushion you leaned on quietly stepped out from under you." "Maggie." "No," she interrupted, voice still soft but firmer now. "Let me say this. For years, I stayed quiet. I helped, I gave, I endured. I thought that was love. But I've come to understand something. Love without respect is just a kind of emotional deadalways, owed, never settled, and I won't live like that anymore." Daniel exhaled, the sound filled with the weight of realization. "I'm not angry," Margaret said. "I'm just done being the invisible one. I've chosen to be someone I recognize again, someone I respect. If that makes me selfish in your eyes, so be it." She ended the call, not in anger, but in peace. Across the table, a beam of sunlight landed on a flyer for that week's storytelling circle. Margaret smiled. For the first time in years, she wasn't someone's afterthought. She was her own beginning. Maggie's new apartment was small, but it came with something her old life had slowly drained away: peace. It wasn't the peace of stillness, but the peace of self-direction. No passive-aggressive remarks. No awkward silences at dinner tables. No sense of being watched while folding laundry or peeling vegetables. For the first time in years, she had her own space, and with it, her own choices. She kept things simple: bare walls, soft curtains, and a bookshelf that grew heavier each week with library loans. Her morning routine shifted from rushed obligations to slow rituals. She brewed tea instead of instant coffee, sat by the window with a blanket over her knees, and read pages she didn't have to reread because someone had interrupted her. Most afternoons, she walked down to the beach. The ocean had a rhythm that didn't demand anything of her. It didn't ask why she hadn't been more useful that day, or whether she'd taken up too much space in someone else's house. It just moved, persistent, unbothered, infinite. Maggie walked along the shore with her hands in her coat pockets and her thoughts unhurried. Sometimes she'd collect small shells, each one a tiny reminder that beauty could be found in quiet, broken things. And then, one day, she began to paint. It started on a rainy afternoon when the sky turned a soft gray and the air inside felt heavy with memory. Maggie opened the drawer where she'd kept an old watercolor Seda birthday gift from years ago that had never been used. She opened it, spread some newspaper over the table, and dipped her brush into the pale blue. Her first painting was nothing special, just the horizon line, a suggestion of waves. But when she looked at it, a smile flickered on her lips. She hadn't painted for anyone. Not to be praised, not to prove she was still capable, but simply because she wanted to. From then on, she painted most evenings. Sometimes the sea, sometimes a memory. Often, the view from her window, birds on the wire, the play of sunlight on pavement, the quiet dignity of ordinary things. Maggie didn't need applause, she only needed space. And now, finally, she had it. It was a Sunday morning when Margaret opened her laptop and saw the photo. A golden hour portrait, filtered to perfection. Jessica, her granddaughter, radiant in white lace, and her groom beaming beside her. The caption read, "Best day of my life, Sadie, forever love." There had been no invitation, no phone call, no mention of a wedding, not even a vague update about a special event. Just this post public, polished and painfully clear. Margaret sat in silence, not frozen, not shocked, just still. The ache wasn't loud, but it was deep. It spread slowly, like a bruise blossoming under the skin. She hadn't expected to walk Jessica down the aisle. She hadn't even expected a speech or a seat of honor, but a name on the guest list? A greeting? A nod? She had helped raise that girl, held her while she had chicken pox, spent nights in the rocking chair humming lullabies when colic made her scream until dawn, paid for violin lessons, for braces, for the purple backpack with the glitter unicorn because Jessica really, really needed it. But none of that earned her a chair at the wedding, not even a message explaining her absence. Margaret didn't cry out of anger. She cried because something in her, perhaps the last string of hope, had quietly snapped. These weren't tears of rage, they were tears of resignation, of understanding. Her family had never truly seen her not as a woman with thoughts and boundaries, and hurts, but as a resource, an emotional vault, a financial backer, a babysitter, a cook, a warm body when needed. Never as Margaret, never as Maggie. Wiping her eyes, she closed the browser. The silence in her apartment felt different today, not empty, but clean. She didn't call, she didn't write. She simply stood, walked to the kitchen, and brewed herself a pot of chamomile tea. Later that afternoon, on the rooftop garden of the Well House, she hosted the weekly story circle with 6 women who had become her chosen family. They brought flowers, small desserts, and open hearts. They asked her how she was. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret answered truthfully, "I'm learning that being forgotten can hurt, but being seen, finally seen by people who choose you, heals more than you expect." They nodded. No one said sorry. No one tried to fix it. They simply listened. And in that quiet company, Margaret found peace. The knock came on a quiet Saturday afternoon, just as sunlight spilled across the rooftop garden of the Well House. Margaret opened the door to find Daniel standing there, her eldest wife, by his side, their 2 children hovering behind them with shy, uncertain eyes. No words were exchanged at first, just a pause long enough for old memories to rise and settle between them like dust in a sunbeam. "I didn't come to justify," Daniel said softly. "I came to say I'm sorry. I should have spoken up. I should have seen what was happening." Margaret's hands were calm at her sides, but her heart stirred. This was the son who once held her hand after scraping his knee, who had written her letters from college, who had slowly quietly drifted into silence when Angela's voice became the loudest in the house. His wife offered a gentle nod. "We were wrong, Margaret. The way things happened, you didn't deserve that." The children, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped forward and offered small hugs, hesitant but real. Margaret's eyes welled, but she remained composed. "I'm grateful you came," she said. "And I believe you mean it. But forgiveness isn't a door you walk through, it's a path, and I need time to walk it." Daniel nodded. "We'll walk it with you, however long it takes." It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And sometimes healing begins with showing up, not with promises, but with presence. It was nearly midnight when Margaret's phone rang. The screen flashed, "Jessica," and something in her chest tightened. She hadn't heard from her daughter in weeks, not since their last stiff exchange. Margaret answered quietly. Through the static came a sound she hadn't heard since Jessica was a child, a broken sob. "Mom," Jessica's voice cracked. I didn't know who else to call. Derek's been cheating on me, and when I confronted him, he pushed me. Margaret's eyes closed slowly. The pain in her daughter's voice was unmistakable. Raw, real. I'm sorry, Mom, Jessica whispered, almost inaudibly. For everything. For treating you like a burden. For laughing when I should have been listening. I didn't understand then, but I do now. I see everything. Silence held them for a beat. Then Margaret spoke with a calm, steady voice, gentle but firm. I forgive you, Jessica, truly, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting who I am. Jessica sniffled, trying to compose herself. Can I come stay with you, just for a while? Margaret hesitated. Then, with all the love in her heart, she answered, You can come, but not to be rescued. You need to learn how to stand on your own. I can hold your hand, but I won't carry you. On the other end of the line, Jessica began to cry again, this time not just from grief, but from understanding. And somewhere between the pain and the promise, something like healing began. The invitation arrived in a simple white envelope, no glitter, no fancy calligraphy, just a handwritten note in Daniel's familiar script. Mom, please join us for lunch this Saturday. There's something we'd like to show you. Margaret hesitated for a moment before placing the card on her kitchen table. She read it again the next morning, and the morning after. There was no pressure in the words, no veiled manipulations, just an open door. Saturday arrived with crisp air and soft sun. Margaret wore her favorite navy blue sweater, the one with the stitched cuffs she'd mended herself. She brought a jar of her homemade plum jam, unsure if it would be welcome, but comforted by the thought of offering something warm from her hands. Daniel and Jessica were already waiting outside when she arrived. They looked different, not just older, but softened, humbled somehow. We wanted to walk you in, Daniel said quietly. He led her toward the house ahead. At first glance, it looked like any other suburban home. Then her breath caught. The porch, the garden bed under the front window. This was it, her old house. The one she'd quietly left months ago. You bought it? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Jessica nodded, eyes glistening. We saved. We worked extra shifts. We couldn't bear the thought of someone else living here. It's always been yours, Mom. Inside, the house was modestly furnished. No extravagance, just care. A crocheted blanket folded neatly on the armchair. Her framed family photos returned to their rightful place. On the kitchen counter, a birthday cake with white frosting and delicate violet, your favorite. Jessica reached for Margaret's hand. We're sorry. Truly. For the jokes, the disregard, for forgetting who you are to us. We didn't see clearly until you stepped away. Daniel stepped in. We want to begin again, if you'll let us. This time, with you in the center, not on the edges. Margaret didn't speak right away. She walked through the rooms slowly, as if listening to the walls. Then she turned to them and smiled, a small, tired, but genuine smile. Home, she said softly, isn't a place, it's when you're seen. Thank you for seeing me again. And in that moment, something long dormant began to bloom again. Not trust, not yet, but the fragile roots of it. And for now, that was enough. The story doesn't end like a fairy tale, it closes with a quiet rebirth grounded in truth. Maggie is no longer a shadow in someone else's home. She chooses herself, and in doing so, even the meaning of family begins to find its light again.